All right. Hi, everybody out there. This is Matt with the Defunding Climate Disaster Committee, and today we have Marie McNamara sharing her personal divestment story. And yeah, thank you so much for being here, Marie. If you want to either share your screen, I can give you perfect. Uh, and then just make sure I can make this bigger so that everybody can see that. All right, cool. Floor is yours. Take it away. Thanks for being here.
Great, thanks, Matt. Well, my name is Marie McNamara. I work with RMI or Rocky Mountain Institute on climate finance and electric mobility, but I'm here today just as a citizen doing personal divestment. So, this is a presentation about how to make your green greener and why it matters. So, the first point to make is that anyone can be invested and divested. Everyone, regardless of income, really should be empowered to use their salary to build long-term financial security. And you can start investing with any amount. Money is not necessarily inherently complicated, but the complexity comes from the systems that we've built around it. And so I'm going to dissect some of those and talk about what I did. And I hope that this presentation is a guide. I tried to be extremely precise in the resources that I documented. I'm not trying to sell anything. I am simply trying to be really comprehensive in the approach that I took in hopes that it can be used as a framework and no one has to start their research from scratch. So I've cited all my sources, and this is about my process. So our choices really do matter. Your bank is not neutral. Where you bank can either support fossil fuel expansion or it can help build a cleaner, more sustainable world. And your money is part of climate solutions. And moving your money to a bank or a financial institution that or investments that better align with your values is arguably the most impactful thing that individuals can do to support climate. And so personal divestment is ultimately how we're going to lead to collective action change. Personal divestment scaled on the millions really does shift a large volume of capital in meaningful ways. So each person can kind of take accountability on their own. So, how did I start this process? I started by defining the scope and setting a deadline. So, for me, I looked at where I was banking and also where my investments were, both my taxable investments. I didn't have a ton of those, but I had a few, and my retirement accounts. And then I set a deadline because it was very easy to procrastinate this. So I targeted being fossil fuel free by July 4th. So in fossil fuel independence, so to say. I then did some research about my current bank. At the time, my current bank was Bank of America, which is one of the largest banks in the United States and one of the major fossil fuel investors in the world. And I looked at my footprint of my banking profile. I just kind of did like a rough estimate of like a average savings account, and this was equivalent to 21 fewer flights a year. And this decision to switch my bank was the most impactful decision I could make to reduce my carbon footprint. So this is some of the stats about why it mattered. I then developed a process to find a better bank. I assess banks' environmental and social impacts using Protect Our Winters banking emissions calculator to kind of see the emissions profile of my bank that I just, or past bank that I just showed you. And I used Bank Green to look at other climate aligned banking options. I then kind of compared banking institutions' green commitments using the Bank Green's Find a Bank tool. And then from this, I had a couple banks that were options. I then defined my priorities in a bank. I realized that what I valued was an easy to use online banking portal. I didn't exactly care about a brick and mortar bank because I did not go in person very much. And I wanted easy transfers and something that aligned with my values. So the banks that I could choose from were a bit dependent on the state that I lived in, which was Colorado. So there were some really great local banking institutions, but you had to live in certain states where they had banking physical locations. So I went with this bank called Amalgamated, and you could basically live anywhere in the United States. And that's what I went for my basic checkings. I then For a savings account went with Forbright Bank. I looked up kind of competitive market returns and found that 4% APY was what I wanted to target, and then looked for a climate aligned banking provider that kind of met this threshold. So at the bottom here, I have a couple questions that I think would be relevant for someone to ask themselves when they're considering switching banks. Um, I personally had trouble getting started, but I hope that this framework kind of offers some strategic questions to know where to start. Then moving to divestment. My goal was to focus on reducing my exposure to fossil fuel companies, their expansion, and companies whose business models actively profit from their extraction. I noticed that there was really no clear definition of divestment. Some people don't even like the term divestment. I am somewhat in favor of it because I think it represents the fervor and the action that is needed in the banking sector and investment sector. And I made this framework for myself because I recognized that I needed to make progress over perfection. Because if you're going to be invested in the market, well, energy grids still use a mix of some fossil fuels, so it's impossible to have completely zero exposure. So I kind of came up with this framework of like what would be acceptable exposure in my opinion and what I could like shift away from. So direct divestment was fossil fuel companies. That was decently straightforward. Tier one for me was divestment from financiers that fund expansion. These would be kind of JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, etc., the largest fossil fuel funders globally. Then tier two was divestment from institutions that specifically seek to make fossil fuel investment a core pillar of their strategy. An example of this is Berkshire Hathaway. And then tier three was active exclusion of fossil fuel investment funds. So for instance, broad index funds like the S&P 500 are still investing in kind of the fossil fuel sector, and they typically make up about 4 to 5% of that index. So I wanted to actively avoid those with more of a strategic investment strategy. And then what I was accepting was that I was going to have some background exposure from investing in a market that still uses fossil fuel as an energy source. And I accepted that. So I then developed a no list. I kind of educated myself on different entities across sectors that I wanted to actively avoid. And this helped kind of inform my knowledge base. I then developed a reinvestment strategy. So I looked at my retirement and my taxable investments, and I looked to back calculate kind of where there was fossil fuel exposure. So I tried to develop a like informed reinvestment strategy that was based on diversification. So trying to mix my investments. I focused on investing in mutual funds and ETFs as I did not feel the need to research individual stocks, and that kind of minimized some of my research, but also enabled me to be diversified across the market. I aimed for kind of a mix of 60% stocks and funds, 15 to 20% bonds, and 15 to 20% short-term investments. Um, and so that was kind of the diversification approach I took. And then I used two main resources to try to figure out if funds were fossil free or reducing exposure. I used Morningstar to assess the fund performance, and you can sign up for a 7-day free trial, and that's what I did. And I was able to check all of the fund's investments on like a granular level of what stocks they were invested in. And I was also able to use this tool in the right-hand corner, which mapped their oil and gas kind of exposure. So I used this as a benchmark. And Morningstar is also great in the sense that it is a reputable entity that evaluates funds returns. So it also was a tool for strategic investment alignment. I then used this cool, in my opinion, Fossil Free Fund website. It is a nonprofit entity that does neutral analysis on the status of funds, and they rate them across fossil fuel exposure as well as social and societal benchmarks like their investment in arms and so forth. So I did sort of a cross aggregation of high rating funds in Morningstar and fossil fuel free fund ratings, and I kind of matched these two resources to come up with the funds that I felt empowered to invest in. And that was my strategy. Both were free resources and both were reputable and really had no perverse incentives to kind of give misinformation. Um, so this is a summary of my divestment strategy for anyone to take. It's first, assess your bank. I think that this is probably a more straightforward action to take. And I've listed some resources that helped inform my switch to another bank. If you already bank with a local entity, you can even ask them about their divestment strategy, because some of the local banks don't have as robust online websites. And then assess your investments. I recommend assessing them using fossil fuel free funds and also Morningstar, looking up the sustainability and values ratings. Figure out a reinvestment strategy that works for you in terms of the level of funds that you want to invest, your risk tolerance, diversification, and then reducing fossil fuel exposure, and then track and refine. So these are like some of the acronyms that I've used, and I plan to share this deck as a resource for 350 Colorado to leverage in the future. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. And I think it's also important to probably mention that you are not a financial advisor. So,
Oh,
uh,
yes.
yes, so just we'll put that at the beginning as well, so that everybody knows. No, we neither of us are financial advisors. This is just a personal story, a little storytelling here. So, this is what worked for her. And yeah, thank you so much for that, Marie.